Good morning. Welcome to this webinar to discuss TEQSA's fees and charges proposal for the higher education sector. My name's Alistair Maclean. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of TEQSA. I've been here since September last year. Most of you I haven't yet had the opportunity to meet because of COVID and other restrictions over the last few months, but I look forward to that opportunity soon, including as part of the consultation on cost recovery. And with me today is Robert Oliphant, who's the Director of Corporate Services here at TEQSA and is across more of the detail than I am of our cost recovery proposal. So without further ado, we thought what we'd do today is firstly, of course, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and of the lands upon which we variously meet today, and to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today's event will be recorded and it will be uploaded to TEQSA's website, teqsa.gov.au. If you have any concerns or want to inquire further about privacy, then you can do so at our website at teqsa.gov.au/privacy. That's just a note, if you like, in preparation for the consultation today. Today's consultation is the second one that we've held with the sector. We did one a couple of days ago, and we received a number of questions and answers. We'll be posting both the questions we received today and 2 days ago and our initial responses to those questions on our website shortly. We hope that gives a further basis for information about the cost recovery. Today's agenda is quite straightforward. Give you a little bit of context for the proposed cost recovery system, if you like. Our proposed approach, which is in the consultation paper that's been released publicly, the fees and charges that will apply, the timeline for both implementation of the proposed scheme and for the feedback that we are seeking from the sector at the moment. And then finally, of course, we're happy to entertain questions and do our best to answer them towards the end of today's session. So if I might start, the context is, of course, that successive governments since the early 2000s have had policies of charging the costs of regulation to regulated entities. The current government instituted guidelines and a framework for cost recovery in 2015. I just note that prior to the current set of fee waivers that were introduced as a result of the impacts of COVID-19 last year, we had already been charging for some of our services or regulatory activity, and that accounted or added up to around about 15% of our overall costs or budget for TEQSA. But the recent announcement by the government, as you all know, is for TEQSA to transition to recovering around about 90% of our regulatory costs from the sector. And the proposal is for a fee structure that includes a number of basic elements, the phased introduction of a levy, discounts on some fees, and then 100% recovery from commencement on other fees. And that's what I'll just briefly present to you today, and then seek your views and early questions on as well. More specifically, the government's policy framework, the one I alluded to earlier, instituted in 2015, it requires that TEQSA develop what's called a CRIS, or Cost Recovery Implementation Statement. It's a public document. It's made available on TEQSA's website. It includes all the activities for which costs will be recovered. It's updated at the beginning of each financial year and otherwise as necessary during the financial year. It's reviewed annually, including in consultation with the sector, and it's subject to the approval by the Minister on behalf of the government of the day. So it is, if you like, a live document that will guide and instruct and direct the cost recovery system that we propose to implement. And the purpose of today's consultation is to finalise a cost recovery implementation statement for 2022. So you'll see just a brief copy here, if you like, of the front page of our consultation paper. It's available on our website and otherwise, and you go to TEQSA.gov.au and it'll become immediately apparent where to find it for those of you who haven't yet had the opportunity to see it. This slide sets out in diagrammatic form, if you like, the proposed approach to our proposed cost recovery, and is structured around three elements of our activity. So-called application-based charges, which is really goes to our legislative functions to register, re-register higher education providers, and for non-self-accrediting providers to accredit and re-accredit the course offerings that they make for their students. The second component is in relation to so-called single provider charges, and that relates to non-application based activity, to use a somewhat clumsy phrase, and we'll come to the detail in a moment. And the third component of the proposed cost recovery structure is an annual levy to be applied across the sector to all providers. So overall, we propose to recover around about 90% of TEQSA's costs. Most fees as a result, and there's no getting away from this, there will be significant increases in fees for all providers because we're going from 15% to 90%, or at the moment from 0, but from what has been 15% to 90% cost recovery. So we're not going to sugarcoat it. There will be significant increases in fees as a result. Some fees, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail shortly, in particular for course accreditation and re-accreditation, will be discounted on a sliding scale, but we'll come to that in a moment. So for the first component, which I set out just before, application-based charges, registration, accreditation, the proposal is to charge 100% of registration and re-registration costs from the 1st of January 2022. The second component is to charge discounts on fees for course accreditation and re-accreditation from 1st of January 2022. And the thinking behind, or the premise behind the discounted approach to accreditation and re-accreditation is to provide a degree of relief for smaller providers, non-self-accrediting providers, based on their actual student load. And the applied discount range will be from 70 to 0%. This slide just in very straightforward terms sets out the discounts, the discount range, and you'll see on the left there the EFTSL, the number of students, equivalent full-time student load for providers, and the accompanying discount that will provide. So for the smallest providers, 70%, right through to the largest providers of more than 5,000 students, 0. So that's essentially the quite straightforward approach, if you like, to the discounting regime. The second component is for a proposed annual levy, and this is to charge for sector-wide services provided by sector that can't be attributed to a single provider. And the levy would apply across the entire sector for all providers, and the notion is for a phased introduction of the levy, 20% from the 1st of January 2022, 50% from the 1st of January 2023, and then from 2024, 100% of the costs for non-application based regulatory activity. So, and then the third component of the proposed structure for cost recovery is for so-called single provider or standalone costs and charges. And that will apply from the 1st of January 2022 at 100%. And that includes things like TEQSA's investigations, our compliance assessments, the monitoring of conditions that may have been imposed on single providers through, for example, registration. Those charges will be calculated on a per hour basis for the work conducted in those activities. And again, this chart here is to provide you an overall sense of how we've attributed both direct and indirect regulatory costs from our overall budget. At the bottom right-hand side there, you'll see that's basically, that's TEQSA's budget, 18.2 million. And you'll see across the screen there the 9 million or so that's spent on application-based or assessments activities, registration, course accreditation. The approximately 7.5 million attributed to non-application based, the standalone activity, sector monitoring and oversight activities, etc. And the total regulatory expenses of about 16.5 million out of that 18.2. There's a component of our overall budget, currently about 1.6 million, which is directly funded from the budget, and that's essentially for the Higher Education Integrity Unit, and that the cost of that will not be charged to the sector. Just briefly, and this is, put caveats on this, it's an estimate, it's for providers to arrive or calculate at their own costs, if you like. We'll do so in consultation with you, but by provider, our estimates of the imposition of the cost recovery system on the sector is that total fees and charges will range from between $40,000 and $85,000 per annum, with the bulk of providers, I think it was something like 116 by our estimates of the 180 or so providers, paying between $40,000 and $55,000 per annum. Now there's a lumpiness to that because of course the registration cycles cut in and out depending on the provider and where you are in that assessment cycle. But of those total amounts, between 15 and 50,000 in application-based fees, registration, course accreditation per annum, and between 25 and 35 in the annual levy, depending on the state of its implementation, its phase-in over the next 3 years. We do note here that the savings, if you will, from the discounts for accreditation fees are up to about $50,000 per year. Now, that's notwithstanding the fact that there will be an imposition of costs there, but without the discounts, up to $50,000 extra. With the discounts, a savings of up to $50,000. We want to acknowledge here that there's still, and we won't sugarcoat it, there's still a significant increase in costs for providers from the cost recovery model, but the intention of the discounts is to provide a degree of relief for non-self-accrediting and smaller providers. We're happy to engage individual providers on our estimates of costs. Your own estimates may vary from that. Obviously, it's not something for public discussion at this particular consultation or more broadly, but we're very happy to engage with you individually about our calculations and then what your estimates are, and just to give you a little bit more accuracy there and certainty around your expected costs from the scheme as currently proposed. The timeline for the consultation is set out in the consultation paper and on our website, but to remind everybody participating today, it commenced a couple of weeks ago following the Minister's announcement. We're holding 2 public consultation events this week, today of course, and then 2 days ago. We're more than willing to consider proposals for further public consultations. I am going to be attending some consultations through peak bodies with groups of members, depending on the peak body to which they belong. And as I've just stated, we're more than happy to engage providers on an individual basis on the scheme, proposed scheme as well. Our job is to receive, consolidate and present the feedback from the sector to the Minister after the closing date for consultations, which is Thursday the 3rd of June, so 2 weeks from today. And we'll be presenting that to the Minister during July. There's some legislative amendments which have already commenced in the Parliament, which will be required for implementation of the cost recovery implementation statement. And then the proposal at this stage is for the commencement of the scheme as is evident from the consultation on the 1st of January next year. So, feedback. Please tell us about the potential impacts of the proposed changes on you as providers, your assessment of the impacts on students, any other feedback that you have on quality, availability of product, etc. We want to be able to summarise in a holistic and comprehensive way the feedback from the sector in a submission to the Minister, and any ideas that we will have from that about potential adjustments to the cost recovery scheme. So it's really important that your feedback helps inform that process, and the Minister's made very clear to us that he wants to hear the sector's views, and that TEQSA is the vehicle through which to do that. Possible questions that might be considered are set out in this slide. I think they're relatively self-evident. What's your view? Do you agree or disagree? Do you have any comments on the proposed methodologies, in particular on the discounts on course accreditation, for example? And what are your views in respect to the three components, if you like, of the proposed recovery scheme? And we'd be more than happy to hear those and to get your feedback. We want your feedback. That's essentially what we're trying to say to the sector. And that can be done both directly or through our website, fees and charges consultation after TEQSA.gov.au. There's an email address on the screen there for you that you should be able to see at the moment, consultation@TEQSA.gov.au. And Robert and I are available otherwise to engage with you individually and directly on the scheme or the proposed scheme, and to just continue the conversation, if you like, over the next couple of weeks, and of course beyond, over the next 6 months before we introduce the scheme. So without further ado, I hope that was reasonably clear to you. We're sitting in a room here staring at a camera. It's one of those sorts of meetings that the times that are upon us demand of consultations such as this, but we'd be more than happy to take your questions and attempt to answer them now. To the extent that we don't feel confident or are not able to address those questions, we'll take them on notice and we'll publish a more detailed and hopefully comprehensive response for you on our website. The process now is that Justine, who works here at TEQSA, is monitoring the questions that you're posting, and we'll ask them of us, and then we'll try and direct those responses to you now.
Thanks, Alistair. We've only got 2 questions on the chat roll, so may I remind our audience, please post your questions. We will endeavour to answer those during this session. And I will start up at the top. I've got Jared Moore here who's asking, will the public statement contain a rationale for the services that will become costs? There is a need for the sector to avoid costs for services that may not be required or about which we have not had a consultation?
Well, the short answer is yes. So the statement will set out the rationale and the services for which charges will be levied, if you like, or imposed upon the sector. And I understand your point about making clear those charges, those services for which we will be charging, and those other activities that TEQSA engages in for which we won't.
All right, it's good to see more questions coming through on the chat roll. So our next question is from Sally Burt. Is the $88,500 charge for provider category change applicable for any category changing to any other category, i.e. HEP to university college to university?
Okay, so for those who are not aware, this is slightly, well, there's a separate and distinct process underway at present in response to changes to the legislation, reducing the number of categories of providers from 6 to 4. And they will take effect on the 1st of July. Robert, I'm not sure what the charging regime for that process is at the moment, but that's what we're proposing in the CRIS is not related to category change, and the current process underway that will be completed on the 1st of July. What the CRIS relates to is our legislated regulatory functions and activities, registration, accreditation, standalone regulatory activity that applies to single providers, and then a levy covering our other sector-wide activity. But do you have a response there, Robert?
The only other thing is we can provide a little bit more detail on that when we post the questions and answers after this event on the website.
Okay, but thanks for the question, Sally. We'll attempt to address that in more detail in a written response.
Thank you. Just another reminder to the audience, please keep your questions coming through the chat roll. Our next question is from Madeline McManus. Thanks for the presentation, as well as the cost recovery program. Is there an operational efficiency review occurring within TEQSA at the same time to increase cost efficiency of delivery?
Short answer to that is yes. And the other thing I would note is that the CRIS it's not a point in time permanent arrangement for the sector. It is subject to annual review. It's subject to an annual consultation with the sector, in which is an opportunity for the sector to engage TEQSA on how it attributes its costs, how the charges are made. Look, we fully expect that there will be adjustments to the scheme, especially in the first 2 to 3 years, reflecting our engagement with the sector. We're not going to pretend that it's perfect from day one, but what we have attempted to do is arrive at the most accurate numbers that we can based on the workload data that we have and what we think should be the costs that are attributed to our particular types of regulatory activity. The sector will have views about that, and we'll hear them both in this consultation, which may be the basis for some adjustments now ahead of the scheme being introduced on the 1st of January, but also opportunities every year and through each year to make further adjustments to those costs. And, if I might offer a view, there's a silver lining in every cloud. There's an opportunity for the sector to discipline TEQSA's costs regime as much as it is for TEQSA to impose on itself, if you like, or to have a system by which we can also structure and discipline our regulatory activity and arrive at costs that are acceptable and familiar and have a strong rationale to them.
Righto, our next question is from Anna Maria. Main question is regarding the costs associated with investigations. Are there limits to the grounds of investigation or the scale of costs that can be attributed to the provider? Would there be engagement with the provider before an investigation starts? And what of individual complaints?
Yeah, I mean, I acknowledge it's a difficult area, especially when it comes to attributing costs, etc., to an investigation, and at what point do we inform the provider, etc. One basic rule or guide here is that if we investigate on the basis of a complaint or concern made to us, a particular provider around a particular issue or risk, if the results of that investigation is that the allegations are not substantiated and that there are no findings made in respect to those allegations that are detrimental, then we won't be charging for that particular investigation. The second point I would seek to make is that we don't, and this was a question that was asked a couple of days ago, we do have thresholds and standards around which we would base any investigation or compliance assessment. In other words, we don't just respond to media reporting about a particular issue. We have a set of risk thresholds, and we rely on data that we currently hold now, and we treat very carefully and seriously a threshold for commencing any compliance assessment or investigation. So it's not just done on a whim or in response to political pressure or to media reporting. I can assure you of that. So that's another point to make. At what point do we engage the provider, and including on the potential costs of an investigation? That's a really good question. It will invariably be on a case-by-case basis because of variances and differences in the nature of dealing with a concern or complaint and the nature of the investigation or compliance assessment that might follow that. There's no hard or fast rule here. We will have to be disciplined, careful, and win the acceptance of the sector around the costs that are attributed to investigations and compliance assessments, and it's an area that we will have to engage the sector on. I completely understand a position where a provider says, there's an open book here, how do we know, you're going to spend hundreds of hours on an investigation, does that mean we're going to be stumped with a bill for tens of thousands of dollars, et cetera, or more? I understand that concern. It's something that we're going to have to address through this process, and we'd be more than willing and happy to engage you further on it.
Thanks for that, Alistair. I think that's answered David Perry's question about whether a provider will still be charged even if the complaint is shown to be without basis or there's no grounds for a complaint.
And hopefully that's also another lever, if you like, both for us and for the sector in ensuring that, that we're not responding or tying up resources on frivolous concerns or complaints or concerns that don't have a basis to them. And secondly, it provides a level of assurance to the sector that this is not TEQSA just messing around for its own sake, if you like, to put it in the pejorative or simplistic terms, that the basis for our compliance assessments and investigations is sound and has a rigorous process behind it.
Our next question comes from Andre, who asks, our college has 50 students, which makes us more vulnerable than the other 500 students of other institutions. Do you expect us to just go under, or how will we recover these costs?
Sorry, excuse me, I didn't. Our college has
50 students.
50 students, yeah.
And the concern is around there being more vulnerability compared to other institutions. Do you expect us to just go under, or how will we cover these costs?
We know there's no expectation or design or intent for any provider to go under as a result of this proposed scheme. What we've attempted to do is provide at least a degree of relief around the costs of course accreditation and re-accreditation with a 70% discount for the smallest providers in terms of student load. That notwithstanding that, we recognise that there will be costs imposed. If you wish to engage myself or Robert or both of us individually or specifically, then I would invite you to do so and we can discuss it further.
Albert Haddad asks, you mentioned that there is considerable discounts for smaller organisations. Will this sliding discount also be applicable to the non-application based activities and regulatory costs?
The proposal is for that not to happen. Notwithstanding that, of course, we're happy to hear your views and to consider adjustments to the scheme, but at present the discounts would apply to application-based activity in the accreditation side of that application-based activity only, and the levy would be phased in over the 3 years. So that's if you like the relief side of the package, of the proposed package, but the answer to your question is no.
Our next question from Jared Moore is, given that the pandemic has depleted our reserve funds, is it possible to move the timeline for cost recovery back a year? Timing is an issue given we are in the midst of creating our budgets for the financial year and now have an added factor and depleted reserves.
I understand the question. The answer is that it's a matter for the government in the end. It's not our call as to the date of implementation of the scheme. Our job is to implement the scheme as put forward by the government, and that's for commencement on the 1st of January 2022. As part of the feedback that we'll be providing to the government, if that feedback is that the sector would like to see further a further deferral of the scheme, then we'll provide that feedback. But ultimately, that'll be a decision for the government to make in response to the consultation phase that we're now in on the proposal.
Okay, Sid is asking, or more of a comment really, the annual levy should be charged proportionately as 90% of student load is with the university. Charging across the board a levy would suggest that larger providers bear less of the cost. Would you like to comment on that, please?
The levy relates to services that can't be attributed to single providers. So, for example, we undertake an annual risk assessment across the sector of all providers. That's been up until now. That may change in the future. Another service that we have provided is, most of you will be aware of the guidance notes and other publications that we issue around, for example, research standards or governance, the governance elements of the higher education standards framework. So that work applies equally across the sector. The design of the scheme is that the levy would be a standard fee or charge per provider to account for those regulatory activities or costs that can't be attributed to single providers. As an overall proportion of our regulatory activity and costs, it's a small proportion, but that's the way we're structuring the proposal at this stage in those three components: application-based, non-application-based, and sector-wide activity.
Okay, Tess Coughlin is asking, you've advised significant increase in costs and fees. How will this be considered in the annual review of risk indicators for financial viability and sustainability for individual providers, particularly those significantly impacted?
Well, I think the answer to that is that any costs imposed on a provider, whether by a regulator through its cost recovery or through other circumstances that are affecting the provider, including out of the current pandemic, they'll be part of a risk assessment of the financial viability of that provider. I mean, I'm assuming that's self-evident, and that would be part of the risk assessment to the extent that the costs of regulation impose a particular impact on that provider. Robert, anything else there?
I think the answer is yes, those costs would be assessed as part of any risk assessment of a provider. Again,
we're not sugarcoating here. We recognise that this imposes costs on the sector, and that for some providers those costs will not be insignificant. So to the extent that those costs then reflect upon the financial viability and are part of a risk assessment of the financial viability of that provider, then that will present itself. That's the reality of what we're dealing with here.
Okay, Wendy Harding is asking, what is the rationale for not having a discounting regime according to size of HEP for registration and re-registration? This will be a significant burden to very small providers. Is this indicative of a subtext about the government's view of having small, often specialised providers within the sector?
Well, you'd have to ask the government in relation to the second part of that question, to be frank. Robert, how are we structuring how does the proposal structure fees around registration?
So fees are based on their estimated workload according to a registration, re-registration, or in fact any assessment activity. So it's not necessarily based on size, it's based on our workload effort, and that's how the costs are then calculated. However, and that's the proposal, and to that extent that people, providers might have a different alternative, then we'd welcome their views.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got Vanessa Crawford who's asking, it appears that the universities will be exposed to much smaller amount of fee increases while the majority of non-university providers without self-accrediting authority will be hit the hardest. It is concerning that there will be institutions who will remove themselves from providing a fantastic service to the broader range of students. How can this be justified?
Well, I acknowledge the concern. There's a distinction, as we all know, between self-accrediting and non-self-accrediting providers across the sector. And as a result of that, there's an additional regulatory load on non-self-accrediting providers because of the requirement that TEQSA, through legislation, that TEQSA accredit and re-accredit course offerings. There's no getting away from that reality. Our job is to implement the government's decision in respect of a cost recovery implementation statement to be implemented from 1st of January 2022, notwithstanding sector views on the balance of costs and responsibilities and impacts from that scheme across the sector. So there's, to be frank, there's a distinction here between addressing the government's policy position and our regulatory obligation here to implement this scheme.
Thanks, Alistair. Our next question is again from Tess Coughlin. There is roughly $120,000 difference between the 3 proposed registration charges. How much notification will providers be given? This is a huge difference to accounts in budgets.
120,000?
So the re-registration fees, there's 3 tiers, and so there's a different 3 different charges that could possibly be applied, and it's based on a provider's history in terms of finances, compliance, and just track record. As part of coming up to the re-registration process, TEQSA would engage with the provider about how that process would work, and part of that discussion would be in terms of a discussion about the tiered level that provider would fit into.
Yeah.
So we'll try to give providers as much notice as possible in terms of the tier that they'd fit in, and we can provide further detail on the website.
Thanks, Robert. Another question from Vanessa Crawford. How are the different levels in registration renewal, level 1, 2, 3, truly defined? How do we know which level we would be in, and is there substantial difference in values?
Well, that's probably a similar question to the previous one. So it's determined based on the provider's track record and history in terms of compliance and finances, and we'll engage with providers in terms of which tier they'd fit in, and try to do that in a timely manner, so that gives providers as much notice as possible in terms of what tier they fit in as preparation for their submission for re-registration.
Okay.
I suppose one thing there is, we understand the theme that's coming through here and the concern that's coming through here in these questions. Similar concerns were expressed on Tuesday, and we've had very similar concerns expressed to us as well separately. So that's something for us to consider further and to reflect upon both as TEQSA and then in our submission to the Minister around the sector's feedback.
Okay, we've got a question from Kate. Should TEQSA commence charging for compliance assessments, it will be imperative that the assessment outcomes are adding value back to the provider and to the sector. Will there be a framework or similar for how TEQSA will manage and respond to its compliance assessments imposed on providers in the future?
The answer to both those questions is yes. It's an important part of disciplining and justifying any costs that we will be imposing on the sector as a result of our compliance-related activity. So I think that's a really good question, and the answer is yes to both of them.
Albert's asking, commencement in 2022 would be harmful for private providers relying on international students. When enrolments have been affected with no prospect of improvement until 2023 or 2024, the timing of the scheme is detrimental. Should not the implementation be delayed?
Well, that's something for the sector to put to the government, to be frank, because the government's decision has been for the cost recovery to commence on the 1st of January 2022. Our job is to implement that. If the view of the sector, and I express no surprise in hearing the concern and the question, the view of the sector or parts of the sector is that the 1st of January is not tenable, then that's part of the feedback, both to us and then separately and as a consequence to the government.
Okay, Jared Moore's asking, in approaching the registration and reaccreditation requirements, we are calling upon consultants familiar with TEQSA. Is there a way that this process can be used to lessen the time/costs to TEQSA if the consultant's work is able to be recognised?
I'm going to take that on notice because I'm not, to be honest, I don't know the answer to the specific answer to that specific question. So I'll try and address that in our written responses. But if you choose to engage us, I'm not sure who the question is from, but you're welcome to engage me directly, and then we can address that matter.
I've got a question from David Perry again. The underlying assumption of the model, particularly the general levy, is that TEQSA's general activities can't be differentiated amongst providers on the basis of effort. However, it could be argued that providers benefit from those activities in different proportions. That is, larger providers receive a larger benefit from TEQSA's general services by virtue of the fact that they have more students. Is TEQSA open to considering an alternative underlying assumption for the regulatory levy?
I understand and accept the view of the assumption underlying the levy. Yes, we are prepared to consider an alternative, although that would have to be put to the government and then approved. I do note that the more complex the structure and administration of the scheme, then the more, the higher the incidental costs of administering the cost recovery. But David, I take your question. I accept the premise behind the question. I acknowledge and agree with your view of the assumptions behind the levy, and we can endeavour to sort of address that in greater detail, or to provide that view in the feedback that we'll be providing to the government.
All right, I've got a reminder for the audience. If you'd like to post any burning questions in the session, please do so rather promptly, because I can only see one more question to ask. So Madeline McManus is asking, we are a small provider and we are preparing budgets for next financial year now. How can we forecast with a level of uncertainty, I'll start that again. Sorry about that. We are a small provider and we are preparing budgets for next financial year now. How can we forecast with a level of certainty what our TEQSA costs will be, as budgets for next financial year are in the process of being approved now by our board?
Yeah, I understand the question and the difficulty. I accept that there will be some uncertainty for each provider around an accurate estimate of its costs, given the structure of the proposed scheme now, and then the prospect that there may be adjustments to the scheme, including in its timing, as a result of the feedback and the consultation period. I don't know that I can answer it more accurately at this stage. We're prepared to talk to you individually. Perhaps that will give you a little bit more certainty and accuracy in your own projections for your own budgeting purposes. But at the moment, yes, I acknowledge that the timing of both this consultation and the proposed implementation of the scheme will have an impact on budget planning and projections, etc., for every provider, as it does, of course, for us. We're happy to engage you further at an individual level.
Well, that's it for questions on the chat roll. Thank you to our audience. I'll now hand back over to Alistair.
All right. Well, I think you'll appreciate that that the scheme has inherent complexity around elements of it, that the timing is reasonably soon. We have a little over 6 months to go through consultation, feedback to the government, any adjustments that are subsequently made, further consultation with the sector on the final statement, and then of course its implementation. So it's going to be an intense period for both us, and we appreciate for the sector in making the adjustment to the proposed implementation of the recovery scheme from the 1st of January next year. I want to reiterate and reaffirm our commitment to consulting closely with the sector, to hearing your feedback, to adequately summarising and putting that back to the government for their further consideration, and to work individually with you around your own estimated costs and you know the imposition from the imposition of the scheme. And without further ado, I'd like to again thank you for your participation today, and we look forward to being in further contact with you in the next period. Again, thanks to everyone.